It was raining the night they told her she wasn't good enough. Not in those exact words. People like the Hartwells never said the ugly things out loud. But Grace Bennet understood every syllable of what they meant as she walked down that long stone driveway alone, her shoes filling with cold water, the warm gold light of a house she would never be welcomed into growing smaller and smaller behind her. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that some people only feel powerful when they watch you break, and she refused to give them that. So she lifted her chin, she kept walking, and she told herself it did not matter. But here is what Grace Bennet did not know that night, what none of them knew, what would not be discovered for another 41 days. She would be the only person on this earth standing between Robert Hartwell and his own death. Robert Hartwell was a man who believed he could read a person in a single glance. He had built an empire on that belief. He had spent 61 years trusting his own eyes above everything else, and on the night he looked at the woman his son loved and decided she was a stranger, a fraud, a danger to everything he had built, he was as certain as he had ever been about anything. He was also more wrong than he had ever been about anything in his entire life. Because the woman he threw out into the rain that night was carrying a secret. Not a secret she was hiding to deceive him. A secret she did not even know she carried. A secret that had been waiting 35 years for the two of them to finally stand in the same room. And when it surfaced, it would not just change the Hartwell family forever. It would reach across the country and stop millions of strangers cold. This is the story of a proud man, a quiet woman, a son caught between them, and a single act of kindness on a dark highway long ago that nobody remembered and nobody had repaid. It is a story about how the people we are most certain we understand are often the people we have understood the least. By the time it is over, you will know why an entire town went silent. You will know why a man who had never bent to anyone got down on his knees in front of the woman he wronged. And you will understand the one question that haunted Robert Hartwell for the rest of his days, a question he could have answered in a single second at that dinner table if only he had bothered to ask it. He never asked her name. Stay with me, because to understand what happened in that hospital, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. There are 3 turns in this story, and I want you to watch for each of them. The first one will surprise you. The second one will unsettle you. And the third one, the one nobody who was there will ever be able to forget, is the reason this story eventually reached around the world. But before any of that, I want you to sit with 3 simple questions, because the whole tragedy lives inside them. Who was Grace Bennet, really? Why would a self-made man refuse to so much as shake her hand? And what was the one thing she never told a living soul, the thing that would have ended the cruelty before it ever began? Hold those questions. We are going to answer every one of them, and the answers are not what you expect. Robert Hartwell built his fortune on a single rule that he repeated so often his children could recite it in their sleep. Never trust a person who wants something from you. He believed that rule had saved him 1,000 times. He believed it was wisdom. The terrible irony of his life, the irony you will come to feel in your chest before this is finished, is that the one person who never wanted a single thing from him was the very person he pushed away the hardest. He looked at Grace Bennet and he saw everything he had trained himself to fear. He did not see the truth standing right in front of him, because the truth was wearing a face he had already decided to distrust. And that, more than anything else, is what this story is about. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let me take you back before the dinner, before the rain, before any of them knew how close they all were to a truth that had been buried for half a lifetime. Let me introduce you to the man at the head of that table, and to the woman who would one day hold his life in her hands. To understand why Robert Hartwell did what he did, you first have to understand where he came from, because nothing about him made sense without it. Robert was not born into the world he died in. There was no inheritance, no family name that opened doors, no soft landing waiting for him if he fell. He was born in a small, tired town where the factory was closing and the young people were leaving, and his father drank away whatever little the family had. Robert learned early that the world owed him nothing, and he carried that lesson like a stone in his pocket for the rest of his life. At 17 he left home with one duffel bag and $40, and he swore to himself that he would build something no one could ever take from him. For years, that promise was the only thing he owned. He started with a single beat-up truck and a set of tools he bought second-hand. He poured concrete, he framed houses, he worked through winters with his hands cracked and bleeding, and for a long stretch in those early years he slept in the cab of that truck because he could not afford anything else. He ate cold food out of cans. He saved every dollar that did not go back into the work. And slowly, one job at a time, he built a reputation as the man who showed up first and left last and never cut a corner in his life. One truck became two. Two became a crew. The crew became a company. The company became one of the largest construction and real estate firms in the state, and Robert Hartwell, the boy who slept in his truck, became a man whose name was carved into the sides of buildings. But success does not erase where you came from. It only buries it, and the things we bury have a way of shaping us from underneath. The fear that had kept Robert alive as a young man never left him. It simply changed clothes. It dressed itself up as caution, as instinct, as the hard-won wisdom of a man who had seen what the world really was. He trusted no one quickly. He read every handshake for the angle behind it. He assumed that anyone who came close wanted a piece of what he had bled to build, and the truth is that often enough they did, which only proved to him that he was right. By the time he was 60, Robert Hartwell had everything a man could want and almost no one he truly believed in. That, too, is part of this story. There was one strange thing about Robert that no one in his family ever understood. On the wall of his study, behind his enormous desk, in a room filled with awards and photographs of grand openings and handshakes with important men, there hung a single small photograph in a plain, cheap frame. It was old, faded almost to nothing, the kind of snapshot anyone else would have thrown away decades ago. You could barely make out what it showed. And Robert, a man who explained everything, who lectured his children on the meaning of every choice he made, never once explained that photograph. When his wife asked about it, he only said it reminded him of something he must never forget. When his son asked, he changed the subject. For 35 years that little frame hung on the wall of the most powerful man in the room, and not one person knew the story behind it. Remember it. It matters more than anything else in this story. Grace Bennett was, in almost every way, the opposite of the man who would one day try to destroy her. Where Robert was loud in his certainty, Grace was quiet in hers. Where Robert announced his worth, Grace simply lived hers and let people notice or not. She had grown up without money, raised mostly by a father who worked impossible hours and still found the energy at the end of every long day to sit at the kitchen table and ask her what she had learned. He was a gentle, serious man, and he had one belief he repeated to his daughter the way Robert repeated his own. He used to tell her that the measure of a person is not what they do for the people who can repay them, but what they do for the people who never can. Grace did not fully understand those words as a child. She would understand them completely before this story was over. She was a brilliant student, the kind teachers remembered for the rest of their careers, but brilliance alone is not enough when you start from nothing. Grace worked. She worked through the kind of exhaustion that hollows a person out, holding jobs while she studied, sleeping a few hours a night, refusing every excuse the world handed her to quit. She had decided as a young girl what she wanted to become, and she had chosen the hardest possible road to get there, and she never once looked for a shortcut. People who met Grace often mistook her quietness for shyness, or worse, for someone they could overlook. They learned otherwise. Underneath that calm was a will of pure steel, the kind forged only by people who have had to fight for every single thing they own. There was one subject Grace would never discuss, one wall she never let anyone climb. Her father. When people asked about him, something in her face would close like a door, gently but completely, and she would say only a few words. "He's gone," she would say. "But he's the reason I do everything I do." And then she would change the subject, and the people who loved her learned not to push, because the grief behind that wall was clearly something she carried alone. Her father had died, and with him had gone the one person on earth who truly knew her, the one person who had told her every single day that she was worth more than the world would try to make her believe. She kept his memory like a flame she guarded with her whole body. No one understood how completely her father still shaped her life. No one understood how, even in death, he was about to change the lives of strangers he had met for only a few minutes 35 years before. Every tragedy needs a man who could have stopped it and didn't, and in this story that man was David Hartwell, Robert's only son. David was not cruel. That is the painful part. He was kind and thoughtful, and he genuinely loved the woman he was about to fail. His flaw was quieter and more human than cruelty, and it is a flaw that may be the most common one of all. David loved his father's approval too much. He had spent his entire life trying to earn a nod from a man who handed out approval the way a miser hands out money, and somewhere along the way the need for that approval had wrapped itself around David's spine until he could not always tell the difference between what he wanted and what his father wanted for him. He did not know yet how much that weakness would cost. He would learn. David met Grace in the middle of the worst night of his friend's life. There had been an accident, a bad one, and David had spent hours in a hospital waiting room sick with fear, surrounded by strangers, useless and afraid. And in the middle of all that chaos and noise there had been one person who was completely calm. One person who spoke to the terrified families in a voice so steady it made the whole room breathe easier. He did not fully register, that night, what she did or who she was. He only knew that she was the still center of the storm, and that when she finally walked past him in the hallway, exhausted, he felt as though he had to know her or he would regret it forever. He was right about that, though not in the way he imagined. What grew between them was real, and slow, and good. Grace did not chase him. If anything, she made him work, because she had learned to be careful with her heart. But David was patient, and he was sincere, and over months the wall came down just enough. She cooked for him on the rare nights they were both free. She fell asleep mid-sentence after impossible shifts, and he learned to carry her to bed without waking her. She made him laugh in a way no one ever had, and she made him think, and for the first time in his life David Hartwell felt like he was becoming the man he wanted to be rather than the man he had been told to be. He was in love. Deeply, completely, the kind of love that is supposed to be the easy part. He thought the hard part would be loving her. He never imagined the hard part would be defending her, to his own family. There came a day when David decided it was time. His parents were holding their anniversary dinner, a grand affair at the family estate, the whole extended family gathered under one roof, and David made up his mind that Grace would be there beside him. He told himself it would be fine. He told himself his father was a reasonable man who would surely see in Grace what David saw, the intelligence, the dignity, the quiet strength. He chose to believe this because the alternative was too painful to consider. Grace, for her part, did not want to go. Something in her sensed what was waiting in that house, the way you can feel cold air leaking from beneath a closed door. But she loved him, and he asked her to trust him, and so against the warning in her own chest she said yes. She bought a modest dress. She practiced being gracious. She prepared herself, as people who have been judged their whole lives learn to prepare, for a long evening of being measured. David's mother, Eleanor Hartwell, had already made up her mind before Grace ever set foot in the house. Eleanor was a woman who had married into status and then spent decades guarding it with the ferocity of someone who knows exactly how easily it can be lost. She measured every person by what they could add to the family name or take away from it, and she had heard enough about this woman David was bringing home to have decided, in advance, what she was. Eleanor did not need to meet Grace. She had already written the ending. And in the days before the dinner she made certain her husband knew her concerns, planting seed after seed in the most reasonable of tones, until by the time the evening arrived Robert Hartwell walked toward that dinner already half convinced that the woman about to enter his home was a threat. The verdict had been reached. The trial was only for show. So picture it. On one side of the city, a young man and the woman he loved, getting ready together, hopeful, nervous, holding hands in the car on the long drive out to the estate. And on the other side, in a house full of crystal and candlelight, a family already closing ranks against a stranger they had never met. Grace looked out the car window as the gates opened and the enormous house came into view, and for just a moment she reached over and squeezed David's hand a little tighter. He thought it was exciting. It was not. It was the instinct of a woman who had walked into too many rooms where she was not wanted, recognizing the feeling before the door had even opened. She took a breath. She put on the calm she had spent a lifetime perfecting. And she walked in. For a while, it almost seemed as though David's hope might survive the night. The conversation was polite. The food was extraordinary. Grace was, as always, gracious and composed, answering questions about herself with a modesty that should have charmed anyone. But the questions themselves carried a chill underneath the warmth, and Grace heard it even when David did not. Eleanor asked, with a smile, what Grace's people did. She asked where Grace had grown up, and let a small silence sit after the answer. She steered the conversation again and again toward money, toward family names, toward the schools and clubs and connections that the Hartwells used to sort the world into those who mattered and those who did not. Each question was a small test, and each one was designed so that Grace could only fail it. She answered every one with dignity. It changed nothing, because the verdict had been reached before she arrived. Robert said little at first. He watched. He had always trusted his eyes above all else, and now he sat at the head of his table and studied this quiet woman his son had brought into his home, and he saw what he had already decided he would see. He saw a stranger with no name he recognized, from a place he did not know, with no fortune and no pedigree, sitting beside his only son and his entire empire. He did not see the surgeon who had saved more lives than he would ever know. He did not see the daughter raised by a man whose goodness would one day shame him. He saw a threat, and the longer he watched, the more certain he became, until the certainty hardened into something he could no longer hold inside. The room had grown quiet. Everyone could feel it coming. Even the candlelight seemed to hold its breath. And then Robert Hartwell set down his glass and he said the thing that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He spoke calmly, almost gently, which somehow made it worse. He said he had not built everything he had, with his own 2 hands, from nothing, only to watch it handed over to a stranger. He said he knew exactly what was happening here, that he had seen it 100 times, that there are people in this world who attach themselves to families like his for one reason and one reason only. He looked at Grace, this woman he had never bothered to truly speak to, and he told her that she would never be welcome in his family, and that it would be best for everyone if she left now. The table went silent. Every face turned. And David, the man who loved her, the man who had brought her into that room and promised her it would be fine, did the one thing he would spend years trying to forgive himself for. He froze. He froze for only a few seconds. But some silences are longer than the years that follow them, and that one was. In those few seconds Grace understood everything she needed to know, not only about Robert, but about the man she loved, and about the family she would have been marrying into, and about the long, exhausting road that would have stretched ahead of her if she stayed. And so she did not wait for David to find his voice. She did not argue. She did not raise her own voice or beg for a fairness she knew was never going to come. She simply set her napkin on the table, and she stood, and with a composure that should have shamed every person in that room, she thanked the Hartwells for the dinner. She meant it. That was the part that no one there could quite absorb. She thanked them, sincerely, and then she turned and walked toward the door. It had begun to rain. Of course it had. She stepped out of that warm, gold-lit house into the cold and the dark, and the great front door closed behind her with a sound that David would hear in his sleep for a long time afterward. And Grace Bennet walked down that long stone driveway alone, her shoes filling with water, the warmth of the house shrinking behind her, and she did not cry, because she had learned a lifetime ago that some people only feel powerful when they watch you break. She lifted her chin. She kept walking. And inside the house, David finally stood up, finally found his voice, finally moved toward the door to go after her, and his father said one word that stopped him cold. "Sit." And David, God help him, sat back down. That was the moment the relationship began to die, though it would take longer to finish than to begin. Now here is what no one in that house understood as they watched her go. Robert Hartwell believed, with his whole heart, that he had just protected his family from danger. He went to bed that night certain he had done the right and the hard thing, the thing a weaker man would not have had the courage to do. He felt, if anything, proud. And the woman he had just cast out into the rain, the stranger he refused to even name, would in 41 days be the one human being on earth with the skill and the steadiness and the will to keep his heart beating when it stopped. He did not know that yet. He could not have imagined it. And the only reason any of them would ever learn the full, staggering truth of who she was, is because of what began to happen in the days that followed. In the weeks after that dinner, something quietly broke in David. He kept replaying it, the silence, the word sit, the sound of the door. He had betrayed the person he loved most, not with cruelty but with cowardice, and cowardice is sometimes the harder thing to forgive in yourself, because cruelty at least requires conviction. He tried to make it right. He called Grace, he apologized, he raged against his father in private the way men do when they are too afraid to rage in public. And Grace listened, and she was not cold to him, because that was not who she was. But something had shifted, and they both felt it. She told him gently that she would never ask him to choose between her and his family, because love built on an ultimatum is not love. But she also told him, just as gently, that she would not spend her life being merely tolerated, waiting in a hallway for permission to exist. She had too much respect for herself, and for the man who raised her, to ever accept that. Robert, meanwhile, felt entirely vindicated. In his mind, the matter was settled. He had identified a threat, removed it, and the world had not ended, which to a man like Robert was proof enough that he had been right. He expected his son to come to his senses, to thank him eventually, the way David had always eventually come around to his father's view of things. But this time David did not come around, and the quiet distance between father and son began to grow into something neither of them knew how to cross. Robert told himself it would pass. He told himself the boy was being stubborn, that it would fade, that in time David would forget the woman entirely. He was wrong about that too, but it was Eleanor who took the next step, and her step would set in motion the very thing that would eventually expose them all. Eleanor Hartwell was not a woman who left loose ends. Even with Grace gone from the house, she remained uneasy, because she could see that her son was not letting go, and a mother who has built her whole identity around the family name does not rest while a threat to that name remains breathing somewhere in the city. So Eleanor did something she did not tell her husband about, at least not at first. She hired a private investigator. Her instructions were simple. Find the truth about this woman. Find the secret. Find the lie. Eleanor was certain there was one, because in her experience there always was, and she was prepared to spend whatever it took to drag it into the light and show her son once and for all the kind of person he had nearly thrown his future away on. She was about to get exactly what she asked for. The truth. Just not the truth she wanted. The investigator was a hard, experienced man who had spent 30 years finding the things people wished to keep hidden, and he went to work the way he always did, pulling threads, knocking on doors, following the quiet trail a life leaves behind it. And at first, the picture he assembled seemed to confirm everything the Hartwells believed. He found that Grace had grown up poor, very poor, in circumstances that would have crushed most people, and Eleanor seized on this the moment she heard it. There, she said. There it is. A woman from nothing, reaching for everything. To Eleanor, poverty itself was the evidence, proof of motive, proof of the hunger she had suspected all along. She did not pause to consider that a person can rise out of poverty by character rather than by scheme. She had her story, and the first piece seemed to fit, and so she pushed the investigator to find more. And he found more, but the more he found, the stranger his findings became. There was a gap in Grace's record, a stretch of time that did not immediately add up, and Eleanor's heart leapt at it, certain it concealed something shameful. And then, most damning of all, the investigator discovered that in recent months Grace had moved a very large sum of money out of her own accounts, a transfer so significant that Eleanor was sure, finally, that she understood. The woman was in some kind of trouble. Debt, perhaps, or something worse. This, surely, was the desperation that had sent her hunting for a wealthy husband. Eleanor brought all of it to Robert at last, laid it out like a prosecutor, and Robert nodded grimly, because it confirmed the very thing he had seen in his own dining room. They had been right. They were certain of it. And they were about to be proven, in the most humiliating way imaginable, completely and utterly wrong. Because the investigator, the hard and experienced man, kept working, and the picture would not hold together the way the Hartwells wanted it to. Every thread he pulled to expose the fraud he expected to find only revealed something that made the fraud impossible. The poverty Grace came from was real, but so was the staggering, almost unbelievable record of what she had made of herself in spite of it, a record so clean, so accomplished, so relentlessly honest, that the investigator began to feel something he rarely felt in his line of work. Respect. The gap in her record, the suspicious empty stretch of time, turned out to be the period when she had stepped away from everything to care for her dying father, sitting at his bedside through his final months, putting her own soaring career on hold to hold the hand of the man who had raised her. There was no shame in that gap. There was only love, And the large transfer of money Eleanor had been so sure was the proof of desperation, the smoking gun of a gold digger in trouble. The investigator traced it, and what he found silenced him. Grace had not moved that money because she was in debt. She had given it away. Her late father, it turned out, had spent the last decades of his life quietly doing medical work for people who could never pay him, in places most people would never go, and when he died he left behind not riches but a string of unpaid obligations he had taken on to help strangers. And his daughter, rather than walking away from those debts, had taken every dollar she had saved and used it to honor them, to finish the work her father had started, to make sure that the people her father had promised to help were not abandoned simply because he had died. The investigator sat in his car for a long time after he understood that. Then he drove to the Hartwell estate to deliver his report. He told them the truth plainly, because he was not a man who softened things. He told them he had done this work for 30 years, that he had built a career on finding the rot in people's pasts, and that in all that time he had never once handed a client a file like this. There was nothing in it. No lie, no scheme, no secret shame. He told them that the woman they had thrown out of their house was, as far as he could determine, one of the most genuinely good people he had ever investigated, and that the only mystery left in the entire case was why a person like that had put up with the way this family had treated her for even a single evening. Eleanor said nothing. Robert dismissed the report. He told himself the man had simply been fooled, that everyone could be fooled, that he, Robert Hartwell, was the only one who truly saw clearly. He clung to that. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, his chest tightened, the room tilted sideways, and Robert Hartwell hit the floor. It happened without warning, the way these things so often do, in the middle of a perfectly ordinary moment, a cup of coffee halfway to his lips. One instant Robert Hartwell was the most powerful man in any room he entered, and the next he was on the floor of his own study, beneath the wall of awards and photographs, beneath that small faded picture in its cheap frame, unable to breathe, unable to speak, the whole towering empire he had built suddenly worth absolutely nothing against the simple failure of a single human heart. Eleanor's screams brought the staff running. Someone called for an ambulance, and in those terrible minutes, all the money in the world could do nothing but wait for strangers to arrive and decide whether Robert Hartwell would live or die. The man who trusted no one was about to have his life placed entirely in the hands of people he had never met. And the closest hospital, the one the ambulance raced toward through traffic, happened to be the one where Grace Bennet worked. The family gathered in the waiting room, the same kind of room where David had first laid eyes on Grace, though no one was thinking of that yet. Eleanor was beside herself. David was pale and silent, gripped by the particular helplessness of watching a parent's life hang by a thread. Robert had suffered a massive cardiac event, and he was being rushed into emergency surgery, and everything now depended on the skill of whoever happened to be standing in that operating room ready to fight for him. Eleanor demanded to know who was operating on her husband. She wanted the best. She wanted to know that the man holding her husband's life was worthy of it. A nurse checked, and returned, and gave her the name of the trauma surgeon who had been called in, the one already scrubbing in to open Robert Hartwell's chest. And when Eleanor heard the name, every drop of color drained from her face. Because the name was Bennet. The surgeon who would decide whether Robert Hartwell lived or died, the one person in that entire hospital with the skill to bring him back from the edge, was the same woman that Robert had thrown out into the rain. The same woman Eleanor had hired a man to destroy. Grace Bennet, the stranger they had refused to name, was at that very moment pulling on her gloves, fixing the lights, and preparing to hold the failing heart of the man who despised her in her own two hands. She had not chosen it. She had simply been the surgeon on call when the ambulance came in, and by the time she saw the name on the chart it was already too late to step aside even if she had wanted to, because there was no one else, and the man was dying, and every second mattered. So Grace did the only thing the daughter of her father could ever have done. She took a breath, she steadied herself, and she went to work to save the life of a man who had told her she was worth nothing. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is almost too much for a story, and yet it happened. The woman they called a gold digger. The woman they cast out into the rain. The woman whose past they had paid a man to dig through hoping to find filth. She was, in that moment, the single most qualified human being in that entire hospital to save the life of the man who had humiliated her in front of his whole family. And she did not hesitate. She did not flinch. She did not let 1 ounce of what they had done to her into that operating room. For hours she fought for Robert Hartwell's life with everything she had, with the steady hands and the iron calm that David had fallen in love with on the worst night of his friend's life, and when it was over, when the long fight was finally won, Robert Hartwell was alive. He was alive because of her. He owed her the very breath in his body, and he did not yet know it. When Robert finally woke, hours later, weak and frightened in a way he had not allowed himself to feel since he was a boy, he was told what had happened, and who had saved him. They told him the name of the surgeon who had refused to give up on him, who had stood over him for hours while his heart fought to quit. They told him it was Bennett. Grace Bennett. And Robert Hartwell, the man who had built an empire on his certainty, the man who trusted his own eyes above all things, lay in that bed and felt the floor of his entire life tilt beneath him. The shame that washed over him was unlike anything he had ever known, and underneath the shame, something else, something he could not yet name, a strange and terrible recognition, a feeling that there was more here than even this, that this could not possibly be the whole of it. He kept staring at the doorway, hoping and dreading that she might walk through it. And David, standing in the corner of that room, finally understood the full measure of what he had failed to do. The woman he had let walk out into the rain, the woman whose hand he had not chased into the dark, had just saved his father's life while his father slept. Unknowing, David thought of the word sit, and how he had obeyed it. He thought of all the years he had spent trying to earn the approval of a man who had been wrong about the most important thing he would ever judge. And David made a decision in that hospital room, quietly, completely, the kind of decision that does not need to be announced. Whatever it took, however long it took, he was going to make this right. But before any of them could begin to make sense of what had happened, Robert kept circling back to one thing, murmuring it under his breath as he stared at the ceiling, turning it over like a stone he could not set down. "Bennett," he whispered. "Bennett. Where do I know that name?" He could not let it go. Even as his body slowly healed, even as the gratitude and the shame warred inside him, the name would not leave him alone, and neither would the feeling that came with it, the sense that somewhere, long ago, in a part of his life he had buried, that name had meant something. It nagged at him through the long nights in the hospital and followed him home when at last he was strong enough to return to the great quiet house. And one afternoon, alone in his study, weak but restless, Robert Hartwell pushed himself up from his chair and crossed the room to the wall behind his desk, to the small faded photograph in its cheap plain frame that had hung there for 35 years, the one he had never explained to a living soul, the one he had told his wife reminded him of something he must never forget. He had not let himself truly look at it in years. Now he took it down with trembling hands, and he made himself remember. To understand what he saw, you have to go back to the time before the empire, before the money, before any of the certainty that would later define him. Back when Robert Hartwell was a young man with that single beat-up truck and a head full of fear, driving home alone one night on a dark and empty rural highway after a job had fallen through, exhausted, broke, at the lowest point he had ever known. He never saw the other vehicle. He only remembered the sound, and then the world turning over, and then the cold, and the blood, and the terrible silence of a place where no one was coming. He lay trapped in the wreck of that truck on the side of a road in the middle of nowhere, his life leaking out of him into the dark, and he watched, helpless, as the headlights of car after car appeared in the distance, slowed, and then drove on past. No one stopped. No one wanted the trouble. Robert Hartwell lay there in the dark and understood that he was going to die alone, and that the world truly did not care. And then one car stopped. One pair of headlights slowed, and held, and pulled to the side of the road, and a man got out and ran toward the wreck. The man was a doctor, on his way home from his own long day, and he did not hesitate the way all the others had. He climbed into the ruined truck and he kept Robert alive with his own hands, talking to him the whole time, telling him to hold on, telling him he was not alone, refusing to let him slip away. He stayed with Robert through the wait for help, rode with him, and in the days that followed, when it became clear that this broke young stranger could not begin to cover the cost of the care that had saved his life, the doctor quietly paid part of it himself and asked for nothing in return. He refused all thanks. He brushed away every attempt at gratitude. He said only that he had done what anyone should do, and that one day Robert could repay it by stopping for someone else. And then he was gone, back into his own life, and in the confusion and the trauma of it all, Robert never even learned the man's full name. He knew only the first. He had called him Sam. For 35 years Robert Hartwell carried that debt like a coal in his chest. He had become rich beyond his boyhood dreams, and there was no amount of his money that could buy back the one thing he truly wanted, which was to find the man who had stopped on that highway and to look him in the eye and thank him properly, to repay him, to tell him what that single act of refusing to drive past had built. He had searched quietly, for years, through every means available to a powerful man. He had tried to find the doctor named Sam who had saved a nobody on a dark road long ago. He never found him. The trail had gone cold decades before, and eventually Robert had stopped searching and simply kept the small faded photograph on his wall, the only image he had managed to hold onto from that time, a picture that included, barely visible in the corner, the face of the man who had given him his entire life. He kept it to remember the debt. And now, standing in his study with that frame shaking in his hands, he turned it over. On the back, in ink so faded it had nearly vanished, in handwriting Robert had read 100 times and never managed to connect to anything, were 2 words. A name. The full name of the man who had stopped on the highway 35 years before. Dr. Samuel Bennett. Robert Hartwell stood in the silence of his study and felt the whole architecture of his life come apart around him, beam by beam, as the impossible truth assembled itself in his mind. Bennett. The name that had haunted him from the hospital bed. The name of the surgeon who had refused to let him die. The name of the quiet woman he had thrown out into the rain. And then, rising up out of his memory, a voice. Her voice, that night, before he had decided she was nothing, when someone had asked about her family and she had gone quiet and said only a few words. He's gone. But he's the reason I do everything I do. The man who saved Robert Hartwell's life on that highway, the man he had searched 35 years to thank, the man whose single act of mercy had made the entire Hartwell empire possible, was named Samuel Bennett. And he had raised a daughter. He had sat with her at the kitchen table every night and taught her that the measure of a person is what they do for the people who can never repay them. And that daughter had grown up to become a surgeon, exactly like her father, carrying his goodness forward into the world. And 35 years after Samuel Bennett pulled a dying stranger from a wreck on a dark road, that stranger's son brought Samuel Bennett's daughter home to dinner. And the stranger, now a powerful man, had looked at her across his beautiful table and thrown her out into the rain without ever once asking her name. The family Robert had spent his entire life trying to find and repay had now saved him twice, across 2 generations. And the second time, he spat in their faces first. Robert Hartwell, the man who had never bent to anyone, who had never apologized for anything, who had built his whole identity on being right, sat down in his study and wept like a child. He understood now, completely and without any escape, the full shape of what he had done. He had not merely been cruel to a stranger. He had been cruel to the one person on earth he most owed his life to, the living continuation of the only true kindness anyone had ever shown him when he had nothing. Every ugly assumption he had made about Grace, every word he had spoken at that table, every certainty he had carried out of that dining room feeling proud, all of it had been aimed at the daughter of the man whose name he had kept on his wall for 35 years to remind himself never to forget a debt. He had become rich and powerful and respected, and somewhere along the way he had become exactly the kind of man who would have driven past his own truck on that dark road. The understanding nearly broke him. And then he decided to do the only thing left that a man could do. He went to find Grace. Not with money, because money would have been an insult to everything her father had stood for, an attempt to settle with a check what could only be settled with humility. He went to her with nothing in his hands and everything laid bare. And Robert Hartwell, who had knelt to no one in 61 years of life, lowered himself in front of the woman he had wronged and he told her the truth. He told her about the highway and the cold and the cars that drove past and the one man who stopped. He told her about the debt he had carried for 35 years and the search that had failed. He told her that her father had given him his entire life, and that he had repaid that gift by humiliating the man's daughter at his own table. And then he asked her forgiveness, knowing he had no right to it, knowing there was nothing he could ever do to undo the night he had sent her walking into the rain. For a long moment Grace did not speak. She had not known. That is something the world would later find hard to believe, but it is the truth, and it matters. She had never known who Robert Hartwell was when she met David. There had been no plan, no design, no quiet scheme to insert herself into the life of the family her father had once saved. She had simply fallen in love with a kind young man, and walked into a house, and been thrown out of it, and then weeks later happened to be the surgeon on call when his father's heart gave out. She learned the full truth only as Robert spoke it, kneeling in front of her, and as he spoke she heard her father's voice again, the words he had said to her at the kitchen table every night of her childhood. The measure of a person is what they do for the people who can never repay them. And Grace understood, with a clarity that brought tears to her own eyes, that her father had said those words because he had lived them on a dark highway, for a frightened stranger, a lifetime ago. Grace forgave him. Not because Robert had earned it, because he had not, and they both knew it. Not because the wound had healed, because some wounds do not fully heal. She forgave him because that was exactly the kind of person her father had been, and because she had spent her whole life trying to be worthy of the man who raised her, and because she understood that holding on to her own rightful anger would have made her smaller than the example her father had set. It was not a weakness. It was the opposite. It took a strength that Robert, for all his hard-won power, had never once possessed in his life, and he knew it as he watched her offer it to him, and the knowing humbled him more completely than any failure ever had. The proudest man any of them had ever known finally understood that he had spent his entire life mistaking suspicion for wisdom, and that the truest strength he had ever witnessed was standing right in front of him, in the daughter of the man who had saved him twice. David and Grace found their way back to each other, though it was not instant and it was not easy, because trust that has been broken must be rebuilt one honest day at a time. But David had changed in that hospital room. He had learned the cost of staying silent, the price of a single word like sit, and he never made that mistake again. He chose Grace out loud, in front of everyone, for the rest of his life, the way he should have chosen her at that table. And Robert, in the years that remained to him, became a different man, gentler, quieter, less certain of his own eyes and more willing to ask the questions he had once been too proud to ask. He spent the rest of his life trying to honor the debt he could finally name, continuing the quiet work that Samuel Bennett had begun, helping the people who could never repay him, stopping, at last, for the strangers on the side of the road. He had been given a second chance that almost no one ever receives. He did not waste it. And the story did not stay inside that family. A nurse who had been there that night, who knew pieces of it, shared what she had witnessed, and the pieces found their way to others, and the whole impossible shape of it slowly came into the light, and then it spread, the way only the truest stories do, until strangers all across the country were reading it and falling silent and feeling something move in their own chests. People who would never meet the Hartwells or the Bennetts wept over a man who searched 35 years for the person who saved him and then slammed the door on that person's daughter. They saw themselves in it. Every one of us has looked at a stranger and decided, in a single glance, that we already knew who they were. Every one of us has driven past someone we could have stopped for. That is why it reached around the world. Not because of the money, or the empire, or the operating room, but because of the oldest and most uncomfortable truth there is, the one Robert Hartwell learned too late and we still have time to learn. The most important people in our lives often arrive wearing a face we have already decided to distrust. So I want to leave you with the questions that Robert Hartwell had to live with for the rest of his days, because I think they belong to all of us. If you had been sitting at that table, when the silence fell and a good woman was being thrown out of a home she had been invited into, would you have stood up? Or would you have stayed seated, like David, frozen by the fear of losing someone's approval? It is easy to be certain now, watching from a safe distance. It was not easy in that room. And here is the harder question, the one that has stayed with me since I first learned this story. Robert spent 35 years searching for one good man, and when that man's daughter walked into his life he could not see her at all, because he had already decided what she was before she said a single word. How many people have we done that to? How many times have we been completely, devastatingly wrong about someone, and never even known it, because we never bothered to ask their name? Tell me in the comments. Was Robert's apology enough? Or are some doors, once slammed, impossible to truly open again? I genuinely want to know what you think, because I have gone back and forth on it myself, and there is no easy answer. And if this story stayed with you, if it moved something in you the way it moved me, then I have to tell you about the one we are doing next, because in some ways it is even harder to believe. It is the story of a wealthy man who fired the housekeeper who had served his family for 20 years, certain she had stolen from him, and who discovered 3 weeks later that this quiet, overlooked woman was the only reason his entire company was still standing. That one is coming soon, and you will not want to miss it. If you believe, as I do, that a person's worth was never about where they came from or what they looked like or what they could do for you, then subscribe. Because these are the only kinds of stories we tell here, and there are so many more of them left to tell.